differential payment. Payment that is more beneficial to the worker than the regular working hours. If the regular working hour per day is 10 per hour, if the employee is required to work overtime, it tends to come up with different brackets. At which time of the day is the employee working the overtime? If it is from, for example, if it is from 6 a.m. to 10 p.m., the payment will be 1/4 times of the regular payment. What does it mean? The regular payment is 10 per hour. If the employee is required to work overtime during the daytime, 6 a.m. to 4 p.m., 10 p.m. is almost normal working day. So 1/4, what does 1 and 1/4 times? ለወይስ ሂሳብ ብዙ የገንዘብ ሂሳብ ግን አይጠፋም። ከሀምሳ ሳንቲም እንዴት ዳነሽ በዛ
10 ብር አይደለ ነው ፔመንቱ 10 ብር ፕላስ 1/4 of 10 ብር
1/4 of 10 ብር 250 ይሆናል። ስለዚህ 12 ብር ከ50 ይከፈላል። 1 ሰዓት ከሰራ ማለት ነው። 2 ሰዓት ከሰራ 25 ብር ማለት ነው ያገኛል ማለት ነው። If the overtime work is done from 10 p.m. to 6 a.m. ይህ ሰዓት የመኝታ ሰዓት የሚባለው የሰይጣን ሰዓት ሰይጣን ነው የሚዞረው ሰዓት ሰው አይዞርም። ስለዚህ በዚህ ሰዓት ስራ ከተባለ ትልቅ ሳክሪፋይስ ነው። Therefore it will be, the rate will be 1/2 of the regular payment. So ስንት ሆነ ማለት ነው? በዚህ ስሌት ሲሆን 15 በሬጉላር ፔመንት የሚከፈለው 10 ብር ሆነ ኦቨርታይም ሲሆን 15 ይሆናል ማለት ነው። If the overtime is to be worked at weekly rest day, it will become 2 times. Double. Weekly rest day is preferably Sunday, but every enterprise may have its own weekly rest day depending on the nature of the job anyway. But the law prefers to have it on Sunday, but it doesn't necessarily so, especially on the current time, especially those service rendering enterprises. The weekly rest day will be a working day because service requiring people may come during the weekly rest day. Therefore, it will be double. If the overtime is to be worked on public holidays, like what we had yesterday, the payment will be 2.5 times the regular payment. So, in effect, what it means is the law tries to discourage the employer to require the worker an overtime because it may subject the employee to overexhaustion. That is the understanding. By coming up with preferential and differential rate of payment, the law tries to make it expensive. By making it expensive for profit maximizing employer, it will have a deterrence effect. And depending on which is more expensive, the assumption of the law is that it highly discourages requiring employees to work on public holidays. At the second rate, it discourages employers to require employees to work during weekly rest day. Then it goes on to the softer areas. Anyway, this was first introduced by the regulation that have been issued by the ministry. Current time, how is overtime regulated? We are going to see it when we arrive at that point. An additional introduction of this regulation is it tends also to increase annual leave. Annual leaves, being paid leaves. Under the Civil Code, there was a certain label. I think the details it should be for you to see them. In order to have a better understanding, try to compare. This regulation, you will find it in Consolidated Ethiopian Laws, Volume 2. You have there the aggregation. I think at the time of the Civil Code, annual leave was 10 consecutive days per year. From forest service that has been provided, if the employee has from 1 year to 5 years of service, he will be entitled to 10 consecutive days of annual leave with pay. From 5 to 10 years of service, it will increase by a certain margin. Then beyond 15 years of service, there is a certain limit. When you go to the regulation, I think that 10 consecutive days was increased to 14 consecutive days of service. The details, I think, for you to see that. But the general picture is that it tends to increase the social welfare. There was no change with respect to maternity leave. It was only one month, half of it being paid. The regulation didn't change that position. There was no change, I think, with respect to sick leave. It simply maintained what has been provided by the Civil Code. But in maximum working hours and in overtime payment and in annual leave, there was a certain positive intervention by this regulation. But mainly the proclamation was trying to address the collective labor relation aspect, the unionization, the freedom of association aspect, and it tries to regulate strikes. And as a dispute settlement organ, this proclamation came up with Labor Relations Board. Under the Civil Code, labor relation, even though it was regulated under a special title of the Civil Code, Title 16, if a dispute occurs between an employer and employee, like ordinary civil dispute, it was to be referred to the regular courts. But with the coming into force of this labor proclamation, a specialized institution of dispute settlement was introduced, especially for the collective labor relation aspect. The understanding is that collective labor relation is a unique relationship that requires unique method of dispute settlement in order to ensure that specificity, a special dispute settlement organ was introduced. Labor Relations Board. Labor Relations Board was at the time a tripartite organization, a tripartite institution. Members of the Labor Relations Board were to be appointed by the Emperor upon recommendation of the Ministry of Community Development, and these people were to be appointed from members of labor association, employers association, government representative. I think at that time, if I correctly remember, members of the Labor Relations Board were 5. 2 were to be brought from labor association. The other 2 were to be brought from the employers association. Then the presiding was a government representative. So the institution is a sort of tripartite representing 3 interests. Interest of the labor is there, interest of the employers is also there, the government has also an interest in it because it's an issue of social development, economic development. So this arrangement, they consider was instead of the court's determination, winner-loser determination, it will be much more appropriate to have this kind of institution so that collective labor disputes will be resolved through amicable settlement. A solution that may be beneficial to both parties. Instead of determining winner-loser arrangement, win-win solution, an institution that may provide room for win-win solution was preferred. Because if you resolve this collective labor dispute in winner-loser type of dispute resolution, the future relationship of the parties will be adversely affected. if their future relationship is to be adversely affected, it may have a negative effect on industrial peace, workplace relationship, because their relationship is in a continuity. They will remain employer and employee, no matter how the dispute is resolved. Therefore, that type of dispute resolution is unadvisable in collective labor dispute. It is in order to come out of that type of labor dispute resolution that the Labor Relations Board was introduced. So as a duty, it was, so long as it is possible, the Labor Relations Board was required to resolve the dispute through amicable settlement. It is when amicable settlement fails that it will resort to judicial settlement. It had judicial power as a final resort. Unlike court, where it has judicial power from the beginning, the Labor Relations Board had judicial power as a last resort, the preferred way of resolving dispute before the Labor Relations Board was amicable settlement. And the assumption was the relationship requires special treatment. And this was made possible, the Labor Relations Board was made possible because of the emergence of freedom of association. If you don't have freedom of association, you cannot have labor representative. If you don't have freedom of association, you cannot have employers representative. It is from the association that representatives could be chosen and picked for the approval of the empire. This was, I think, the intervention of the Labor Proclamation of 1963. So now, somehow, at the time of the emperor, the intervention was not limited to individual labor relation. It was also covering the collective labor relation aspect. For some time, we had this kind of arrangement in Ethiopian working place history. But this doesn't last long, unfortunately. Sometime in 1974, almost after only a decade, after only 10 years, there was a change of a government. The Provisional Military Administrative Council, locally known as the DERG, assumed power in 1964. As soon as the DERG assumed power, it had a different political orientation than the previous regime. It tended to hold socialist, at times communist ideology. So it tended to be leftist. Therefore, different ideological orientation. The earlier was capitalist way of development. Under the time of the emperor, even though the country was very much an agrarian, the developmental path was towards capitalist mode of production, and the relationship of the emperor was more of Western style. But as soon as the Derg assumed power, there was a sort of a paradigm shift from the Western ideological orientation. It shifted to the Eastern Bloc, to the socialist bloc. And the ideology was from capitalist path of development. It tended to adopt socialist path of development. With the socialist path of development as a developmental paradigm, the role of the state into the economy was going to be more visible than in capitalist ideology. The role of the state in the economy is a little bit docile. Economy is to be left, in principle, economy is to be left to the private parties. State intervention will come if and when the market didn't work well. That is the philosophy. Otherwise, it is to be left to the private parties. But in a socialist path of development, the role of the state in the economy is to be more visible, because the understanding is that private sector is exploitative. It need even to be discouraged. With this ideological orientation, as soon as the Derg assumed power, it tended to take drastic measures. On means of productions, and distributions, or large scale, of course. These are the economically determining. Large scale means of production and means of distribution were nationalized, taken into state hand. Factories and wholesale distribution centers of the products that have been distributed. This was nationalized. So nationalization. Of means of production and distribution. You remember, as soon as the Bolsheviks assumed power in Russia, that was the measure they took because of their socialist and communist ideological orientation. Even though they are privately owned, the true owner is the labor force, because this has been accumulated by unpaid wage. Therefore, let's take these products back to the true owner. And the Derg's ideological orientation being in line with that, they took that measure. Factories were nationalized. agricultural plantations, agricultural farms were nationalized, etc. They didn't stop there and there. They also nationalized banks and insurance companies. They also nationalized rural land. Until that time, rural land was owned by the nobility and the clergy, but with the coming into force of the military regime, መሬትን ጠፍጥፎ የሰራ የለም። መሬት የተፈጥሮ ሀብት ነው። ስለዚህ የህዝብ ነው ምን ያለበት፣ ህዝብ ደግሞ በመንግስት ነው የሚወከለው። ስለዚህ የገጠር መሬት የህዝብና የመንግስት ነው ተባለ። then urban land and extra houses. Were also nationalized. Urban empty lands were to be nationalized. Extra house to mean an house that is in addition to where you live. If it was rented out to someone, the rent will be paid either to the company or to, depending on the amount of rent. If the rent is low, it will be the company that will collect the rent. If the rent is ከመቶ ብር በላይ የሆነው ለክራይ ቤቶች፣ ከመቶ ብር በታች የሆነው ለቀበሌ ቤቶች ግን ተወረሱ። ሰው ትንሽ ገቢ ያገኛለሁ ብሎ በግቢው አካባቢ ወይ በዋናው ቤት እየኖረ የጀርባ ቤቱን አከራይቶ ከሆነ አዋጁ ሲመጣ ዋናው ቤት ያንተ ነው፣ ጀርባው ግን ተወርሷል። ትርፍ ቤት ነው። ምክንያቱም ያከራየው ትርፍ ስለሆነ ነው። ስለዚህ these all economic measures were taken as soon as the Derg assumed power. So the Derg was there as a legislator, not only as legislator, executive, and judiciary, the traditional roles. The government was very much visible in the economy because it owns the factories, it owns the banks, it owns the hotels, it owns the land, it owns the urban, not only the rural land, the urban land, and of course the extra houses. Therefore, higher visibility in the economy. That is expression of socialism, unfortunately. So with this, there is a need to come up with a legal reform that would be consistent with this philosophy. And one of the areas that required reform was labor relation. So as soon as it assumed power, I think 1976, because 1975 Maskaram, it was in September 19. So የፈረንጆች ዓመት ደግሞ የሚቀየረው ጃንዋሪ ስለሆነ sometime after 6 months, the Derg came up with a labor proclamation that was crafted on that ideological basis. Labor proclamation of Labor proclamation number 64 of 1976. No, 1975. technically it appears as though it is after 1 year because the Derg assumed power in 1974, but it's not the case. It is because the new year begins in January that we have that. Otherwise, it's almost in a short span of time that the labor proclamation came up. Actually, it was after 1 year, I think. Yeah, because in Amharic, our ቁጥር 64 68 means, of course, after 1 year. Because 67 was the time that the Derg assumed power. Anyway, it's not very long. So, this proclamation came into effect. The earlier proclamation, labor proclamation, አሰሪና ሰራተኛ ጉዳይ አዋጅ ቁጥር 210/1955 ነበር በአማርኛ የሚቆጠረው ቅድም ስገልጽላችሁ የነበረው። ይሄ አዋጅ 64/68 ግን የሰራተኛ ጉዳይ አዋጅ ነው የሚለው። 64/1968 Do you see any difference in this?
The first one?
Earlier the understanding was labor relation is a relation between a legal instrument that regulates employer-employee relationship. But with the new philosophy, it is an issue of the labor. The employers, especially the private employers who are going to see that, since they are considered as exploiting class, and since they are considered as class enemy, they are not yet, they are not there to be regulated. They are there to be marginalized. We shall see. It begins from the name. But it's not only the name that tries to explain that instrument. So with this proclamation, there were a lot of new things that has been introduced by this proclamation. First of all, it came up with additional social welfare provisions. Annual leave became longer. Maternity leave became longer. Sick leave became longer. Additional leaves were also included. Union leave, educational leave, leave for education purpose, leave for union works purpose, morning leave when a certain problem in the family occurs. There were also paid leave. So a lot of leaves were introduced. Those already introduced by the civil code, their length was extended. For example, annual leave, at the time of the civil code and later at the time of the regulation that was issued pursuant to 2010 of 1955, for a length of service between 1 and 5 years, it was 14 consecutive days of annual leave. On the basis of Labor Proclamation number 64 of 1975, 14 working days for a year of service and an additional addition of 1 working day for every additional year of service. Working days for 1 year of service and an addition of 1 working day for every additional year of service. For example, a gentleman who served 5 years what would be his annual leave, her annual leave as the 5th year on the basis of the regulation 604 of 1990. Anyway, that regulation 1964. On the basis of the proclamation, labor proclamation. Do you see any difference? Yes. There's a point, but you try to interpret it differently. And be it in the proclamation, the civil code, or the regulation, annual leave was considered in the form of consecutive days. But with the introduction of the labor proclamation, annual leave was considered in the form of working days. This has a significant difference. When annual leave is considered in the form of consecutive days, the holidays are to be considered as part of the leave. For example, 14 ቀን ከተባለ ከሰኞ ጀምሮ ሰኞ፣ ማክሰኞ፣ ቅዳሜ፣ ሰኞ፣ ማክሰኞ፣ ሮብ፣ ሐሙስ፣ ዓርብ፣ ቅዳሜ፣ እሑድ ብሎ 14 ቀን ትቆጥርና ሊብህ ያበቃል ማለት ነው። በወርኪንግ ዴይ የሚቆጠር ሊብ ከሆነ ግን የድርጅቱ የስራ ቀናት ምንድን ናቸው ይባላል። ከሰኞ እስከ ዓርብ የሚሰራ ድርጅት ከሆነ ሰኞ፣ ማክሰኞ፣ ሮብ፣ ሐሙስ፣ ዓርብ እነዚህ ወርኪንግ ዴይ ናቸው። 5 ቀን አገኘ ማለት ነው። ቅዳሜና እሑድ እረፍት ስለሆነ አኗል ሊቡ ላይ አይታሰብም። እሱ ዝም ብሎ ይደመራል ማለት ነው። ስለዚህ የተጠቀምከው 7 ቀን ነው፣ ግን 5 ቀን ነው ከአኗል ሊቡ የተጠቀምከው። ስለዚህ 14 ለመሙላት ሌላኛው ሳምንት ላይ ደግሞ 5 ቀን ይሆናል ማለት ነው። 2 ሳምንት ሆነ፣ 10 ቀን ወሰድክ። 4 ቀናት ደግሞ ቅዳሜና እሑዶቹ ዝም ብለው ይደመራሉ። ምክንያቱም የሊቡ ፓርት አይደሉም። ኦልሬዲ አኳየርድ ናቸው ለእረፍት ቀናት አይደመሩም። ስለዚህ ሌላ 4 ቀን ይጨመራል ማለት ነው። ስለዚህ ወደ 3 ሳምንት ይሄዳል ማለት ነው። when you count in terms of working days, it will be around 18 days or 21 days anyway. በመካከሉ የህዝብ በዓልም ከተገኘ it will not be counted as a leave. It will be an addition. So በኮንሴኪቲቭ ዴይስ መቁጠር እና በወርኪንግ ዴይስ መቁጠር ትልቅ ለውጥ አለው in the length of the annual leave. It will be longer when it is counted in terms of working days. So ሌበር ፕሮክላሜሽን ያመጣው therefore 14 የስራ ቀን ቢልህ 14 ቀን ብቻ አይደለም የምታርፈው ማለት ነው። ወደ 21 ቀን አካባቢ አርፈ ነው የምትመጣው ማለት ነው። በመካከሉ እሑድ፣ ቅዳሜ የህዝብ በዓል ስለሚኖር እኛ ደግሞ በበዓል በሽ የለብንም። በዓላት 13 ምናምን አለ መሰለኝ ውሸት ናቸው። So this is attempt to grant the employee an extended leave with pay so that he will have time for social affairs. Maternity leave በሲቪል ኮድ ጊዜ 1 ወር ነው ብለናል። ከዚህ 1 ወር 15 ቀን ብቻ ነው 10 ደሞዝ የሚከፍልበት ብለናል። 15 days is without leave. With the coming of Labour Proclamation 64 of 1975, it was increased to 45 days with full pay. So, in terms of length, it has increased. In terms of benefit also, the whole maternity leave was with pay. 1 month and a half. Sick leave, under the civil code, I think it was 1 month with pay for someone who served more than 1 year. If it is below 1 year, there was no typical entitlement. It will be following the civil code. Under the Labour Proclamation, it was very much generous. 6 months in a year. The first month with full pay. The next 2 months with half pay. The remaining 3 months with no pay. So the employer will put your position vacant for 6 months, but in terms of payment, the first month of sickness will be with full pay. The next 2 months of sickness will be with half amount of pay. And the remaining 3 months will be with no pay. አሁን ነው መታመም ያሰኛል። It was very much interesting. I think up to now we shall see at the present. We are sticking to that. So you have that. Union leave for union officials, if they are going to go for a union meeting, they will be given leave with pay. If they are going to court to defend their members' interest, they will go to court with pay. If they are going to appear as a witness, they will go to court with pay. If they are to sit for collective bargaining, they will go to the bargaining table with pay. So every leave that is associated with union objective, it was paid leave. Education, if there is an education that has been arranged by the employer will grant leave with pay for the purpose of the education. Morning leave if death of a close relative, a sickness of a close relative, or something associated with that, there will be leave with pay. Leave for marital purpose. If the employee is to conclude marriage, he was also entitled to a certain amount of leave with pay. So there was a lot of entitlements introduced by that proclamation. Labor aspect. Unionization. The labor proclamation came up with a legal framework that allows unionization to the employees. Employers were denied to form unions because the political orientation was, of course, the major employer was the government, but it doesn't mean that the whole private sector was dead and with. There were small restaurants, small garages still owned by private individuals that employ bigger amount of employees. So in that, there will not be an association of garage employees. There will not be an association of restaurant owners or cafe owners association, because under dictatorship of the proletariat, the private sector need to be denied of its democracy. If you allow them to associate, that means you are giving them democracy. That was not allowed by the socialist system. Dictatorship of the employer, the proletariat over the employer, over the capitalists means capitalists will not need to be marginalized, not only from the economic sphere, but also from the political sphere, from the democratic space. Being consistent to that ideology, the labor proclamation didn't allow employers to associate. that is again another important thing to note as a defect of the proclamation, as the undemocratic nature of that proclamation. But not only employers were allowed to associate freely, the minimum membership to 4 millions was also reduced. Under the Labour Proclamation of 1963, at the time of the Emperor, in order to form unions, minimum membership was there should be 50 members. In a trade union. But under this proclamation, the Proclamation 64 of 1975, minimum membership was reduced to 20. 20 members were sufficient to form an association, to form a trade union. What do you think is that? What does it mean? Yes. You see, when you put a higher threshold of membership, it may be tantamount to denying membership. When you put it at a higher benchmark, many enterprises, many employees in smaller enterprises may not attain that number. If they cannot attain that number, they may not be in a position to organize. But when you reduce the number, it will be paving the way for employees, even in smaller enterprises, the opportunity to unionize. Unionization is power. Therefore, you are according power to them. That means. Actually, one of, I failed to mention this as a limitation of the proclamation. One of the criticisms against that proclamation, Proclamation 210 of 1963, is that by putting higher threshold of membership to form associations, it in effect limited their implementation aspect. Of course, the fact that freedom of association is allowed is a good thing, but by putting higher threshold, it tendency limited its effect to only enterprises that employ higher number of labor force. Because at that time, given the Ethiopian level of development at that time, an enterprise that employs 50 or more employees is an enterprise in a very improved working system. Many of the enterprises at the time have labor force below that. So many of the employers in this time were not covered by this proclamation. But now, by reducing the threshold, they tend to allow employees of even smaller enterprises to unionize. At the time, what is the minimum threshold? In the current proclamation. ድንገት ገዝታችሁ ስታገላብጡ አይታችሁ ከሆነ ስራ ያላችሁ 10. This number had further reduced to 10 in the current proclamation. Sometimes when you go lower and lower, you may again get the drawback that fragmented aspect of unionization may occur. Anyway, we will discuss that at a later stage. So, this is again another introduction of this labor proclamation. Employers were not allowed to associate. Because of that, since the labor relation board was to be considered as a tripartite institution, there was no more labor relations board. As a tripartite, because one of the tripartite pillar was not allowed to form an association. So, as a result of this, the ILO, when the DER was in power, every time the ILO conference comes, every time Ethiopia as an agenda comes on the ILO conference, of course there were a lot of criticisms against the DER, but one of the consistent criticisms was Ethiopia was not complying with its international obligation of complying with Convention number 87. Convention number 87, Freedom of Association Convention. It grants power to both parties. Both employers and employees should be given an opportunity to form associations of their own choice. That was the prescription. And member states are obligated to create an enabling environment, legal environment, to this effect. But now, with the DER dispossessing the right to form association for the employers, it was going against its commitment under that convention. Therefore, every time, the whole 17 years, if you try to see the resolutions of the ILO, you will find this criticism consistently spelled out against Ethiopian authorities. But they didn't back down until their downfall. So with this, then in terms of employment security, this is again another important point to note. Under the Civil Code, no termination of a contract of employment without justifying cause was introduced. That was a good beginning to ensure employment security, employment stability, so to say. But if someone terminates a contract of employment without justifying cause, the remedy was to compensate the terminated employee to the extent of 3 months' wage. But with the introduction of this labor proclamation, employment security was regulated differently. First of all, the legislator came up with valid grounds of termination. Valid grounds of termination spelled out by law. And any termination outside of those grounds will be considered invalid. And if an employee is terminated on invalid grounds, he or she will be entitled to reinstatement with back pay. So, valid grounds of termination spelled out by law, no flexibility. That means they are legislatively determined. Then any termination outside of this shall be unlawful. Termination outside of this shall be unlawful. Then if it is unlawful, it shall be deemed as though the contract of employment was not terminated. If the contract of employment was to be considered as it was not terminated, the effect was that means the employee will be reinstated to his or her previous job position with back pay. With back pay means the wage that was not paid in the period of termination will be given back to the employee. So this was very much detrimental to many enterprises because they were being required to pay wage for unrendered service. Even some writers tend to say that one of the reasons for their bankruptcy was this kind of excessively pro-labor provisions. So, cost of hiring was very much expensive at the time of this proclamation. Because የቅጥር ሁሉ ይቋረጣል ከዚህ ውጭ ሊሆን የሚችለው ምክንያቱም ሌጅስሌተሩ ሌጅስሌት ሊያደርግ የሚችለው በጣም የተወሰኑት in employer-employee relationship there will be a lot of reasons for terminating. Then if termination is only to be considered valid in those legislatively determined grounds, obviously the employee will go to court considering that his termination or her termination is unlawful because he is not going to pay anything anyway. Court fee for employee is zero. As far as the mamelkecha is concerned, anyone can write it down without fee or on pro bono or with fewer fees. So he may stay in litigation for around 1 year and a half. At the end of 1 year and a half, he will be awarded reinstatement with 1 year and a half wage to be paid by the enterprise. So this was the order of the day. Anyway, since the major employer was the government, many of this legislative cost was to be covered by the government. The private sector was very much marginal. That doesn't mean that cases from the private sector was not going to court, but many of the cases were going to court from the state enterprises, from the state-owned enterprises. It was the state-owned enterprises that were incurring this cost. Because of this and many other reasons, many of the state enterprises were loss makers. They were being subsidized from the national treasury to maintain them. They are there to make profit and to generate employment, but at the end of the day, they are there to make losses, and the loss makers ናቸው ብለህ ባንክራፕሲ ዲክሌር እንዳታረግ ደግሞ ሰራተኛ ሊበተን ነው። The other objective, employment generation, will be at stake. Therefore, in order for the employee to remain engaged, you need to subsidize them from the national treasury. Therefore, they are as good as ቀዳዳ በርሜል ውሃ ትሞላለህ ከታች ያፈሳል። This was the order of the day, and where we had it. Okay, the details, I think you need to have those instruments on your table to get detailed comparison, because I cannot compare all the provisions. Okay, maybe with this, again, the new, with this we remain with this proclamation with almost 17 years. After 17 years, the downfall of the Derg and the APRDF assumed power in 1991, then 1992, 93, proclamation number 42 of 1993 will come into effect. I think it may not be an appropriate time to discuss it at this level. Maybe before winding up this class, we have something about what we discussed today and maybe last week. You will be welcomed. Yes. Usually, there is a trick aspect in it when we get it in practice. አንዳንድ ሰራተኞች ይታመሙና አንድ ወር ይተኛሉ። አንድ ወር ከተኙ በኋላ ከአንድ ወር በኋላ ወደ ግማሽ ደሞዝ እንደምትገባ ስለሚያውቁ በግሩፕ ውስጥ ተደግፈው ቢመጡ ይሰሩታል። አንድ ሳምንት እንትን ያሉ ቢሆን ስለዚህ ኢንተራፕሽኗን እንትኗን ይሰሯታል ማለት ነው። ምክንያቱም ህጉ እያሰበ ያለው ከባድ ህመም ነው። 6 ወር ያስተኛል ነው። ስለዚህ 6 ወር ማክሲመም ጠብቆ 6 ወር ጊዜ ውስጥ ከተመለሰ ካልተመለሰ ግን የቅጥሩ ሁሉ ያቋርጣል። በተለይ ክፍያ ግን በ3 ወር ጊዜ ውስጥ ማቆም አለበት። It will be uneconomical to compel the employer to pay more than that. Of course, this procedure actually is not at liberty. It needs to be medically certified. Actually, it is not only ታመምኩ ስላለ ጸበል ስጠመቅ ከረምኩ ስላለ አይሰጥም። It needs to be informed to the employer in advance that this problem has occurred, and at the end of the day, in order to benefit, it needs to be medically certified that the sick leave was upon the recommendation of the physician. Otherwise, it's not by the mere fact that you claim it that you are not going to get it. But assuming that ይመጣና ኢንተራፕት ያደርገዋል። ስለዚህ ተመልሶ ከሁለት ሳምንት በኋላ ሊቭ ሲሄድ የግማሽ ደሞዝ ነው የሚከናወነው ወይስ የፉል ፔይ ይጀምራል የሚል ክርክር ይነሳል በተጨባጭ። With this, there are different arguments, and in the current proclamation, I think it is an aggregate. Let's see how በአራት ዓመት ጊዜ ከዚህ በላይ ሊሆን አይችልም ምናምን የሚል ገደብ አስቀምጦበታል። ይህን ክርክር ለመገደብ ግን በአንድ ጊዜም ተወሰደ። After having completed his probation, is rendered incapable of working due to sickness other than employment injury. Employment injury, as I told you last week, is to be regulated under another section, not under sick leave. This is sick leave that is purely biological, that is not associated with employment. The leave referred to in sub-1 of this article shall in no case be more than 6 months, counted consecutively or separately in the course of any 12 months period, starting from the day of his sickness. So it may be interrupted or it may be consecutive, but it cannot go beyond 6 months in a month, 6 months in a year, either consecutively or with interruption. The problem is interruption directly from the capital. የሚል ነው ዝግብ የሚነሳ። If they come and somehow interrupt the consecutivity, I think it is going to be paid as a fresh leave for purpose of payment. But for purpose of counting, it is going to be 6 months, whether as a consecutive or within a total of years. እኔ ግን መተኛት አልፈለኩም ልሰራ ፈለኩም ብሎ ሲመጣ እንግዲህ ጨከም ያለ ኢምፕሎየር ካልሆነ በቀር አይ ውጣልኝ ለ2 ወር እረፍት አለ የሚልበት ትንሽ ከበድ ያለ ነው የሚሆነው። በዛ መልክ ነው ፍቃድ ግን የሚሰጡ it depends on every physician cannot give sick leave. I think there is a hospital regulation that determines that. In Arabia, how long leave it can give. A hospital, how long leave it can give. I think it is regulated through medical prescription. አንዳንድ ሰዎች የሚያመጡት ጤና ጣቢያ ውስጥ የሆነ ዘመን ሊኖራቸውና 3 ወር እረፍት ሰጥቶኛል ብሎ የጤና ጣቢያ 3 ወር ይዞ ይመጣል። But when you try to refer to the medical authorities, the ጤና ቢሮ, the health bureau, they may tell you that well, a clinic cannot, a physician in a clinic cannot do that kind of length of leave. It depends on the specialty in order to give leave. Therefore, the employers usually challenge that. One. The other thing, in many companies, employers have their own medical service arrangement with hospitals. Many companies have that type of arrangement. If they have that type of arrangement, you need to bring leave from that institution, not a sick leave from a place of your pleasure. Because in Ethiopia, አንዳንድ ችግር ያጋጥመናል። እዚህም ትምህርት ቤት ስናገር ሲሆን ተማሪ ሳይታከም ሳይፈተን ይቀርና ታምሜ ነበር ይላል። በዛ ቀን ታመህ እንደነበር ማስረጃ አምጣ ሲባል ከግል ክሊኒክ ነው ከመንግስት ክሊኒክ ማመጣ ብሎ ነው የሚጠይቀው። ስለዚህ ከግልም ሊያመጣ ይችላል ከመንግስትም ሊያመጣ ይችላል ማለት ነው። It's as simple as that. So if we are going to leave it to the employee, many employers will be at risk. They are going to pay. Sometimes the employee who claimed to have been sick at that time may have any other employment engagement somewhere. Therefore, in order to do away with that, the law has granted the employer to limit the source from where sick leave can be obtained. Unless the employee falls sick somewhere outside of the area where that institution is far away, if there is a room to go to that institution, the employee should go there. First of all, it is for free because it is going to be covered by the employer because of the contractual relationship. Then the other reason is this institution will be very much restricted in granting leave. Otherwise, other physicians may be liberal in giving the worker back to they may grant leave. That in order to avoid that risk, the law has either by a collective agreement or by a work rule, it may determine the acceptability of the sick leave from certain sources. Otherwise, in principle, any certified medical institution may have the power to grant sick leave. If you try to see, without prejudice to the stipulations of a collective agreement, a worker shall be entitled to sick leave upon presenting a valid medical certificate issued by a duly recognized medical facility. So without prejudice to stipulations in collective agreement means if the collective agreement or the work rule specifies from where the sick leave permission would be obtained, you need to comply with that. Okay? Okay, then next time we are going to see Proclamation 42 of 1993. This is a proclamation adopted at the time when the transitional government of the NDRPF was in power. So the remaining instruments are more or less similar in content and structure. For 4893, 377, 2003, then the present one, I think, 1156 of 2019. I think we are going to move faster because they are within the same ideological and economic policy framework. Therefore, they don't have significant deviation among each other. So we are going to move a little bit faster and wind up our discussion on this maybe on Thursday. Okay, you are dismissed.